The story of Adolph "Champ" Reynoso begins not in the chaos of prison, but in the fading light of a hospital room in 2018. The man once known as one of the most disciplined soldiers of the Mexican Mafia lay dying under federal watch in a Colorado hospital. At 75 years old, his body, strong and unbreakable for most of his life, had finally yielded to cancer. The walls around him were silent, the same kind of silence that had defined his existence in the solitary concrete cells of America's highest security prison. For those who knew of him, his passing marked the end of an era. Reynoso wasn't just another gang member who rose through blood and violence. He was part of the old guard, a generation of men who helped mold the Mexican Mafia into one of the most structured and feared criminal brotherhoods in the United States. His story, much like the organization he helped shape, begins in the turbulent streets of East Los Angeles. Adolph Reynoso was born on August 21st, 1943, in Denver, Colorado, during a time when Mexican-American families were migrating west in search of work and stability. His family soon settled in East Los Angeles, a neighborhood that would become a breeding ground for both cultural pride and criminal identity. The post-war years were hard on Mexican-American youth. Poverty, discrimination, and social isolation created an environment where street gangs offered both protection and belonging. In this climate, Reynoso found himself drawn to the local gang known as Big Hazard. Centered around the Hazard housing projects, Big Hazard was one of East LA's most established gangs, a tough, close-knit group where reputation meant survival. It was here that Reynoso earned the nickname Champ, a nod to his physical prowess and iron discipline. Unlike many who joined for the thrill or status, Reynoso carried himself with quiet confidence, earning respect not just for his ability to fight, but for his calm control in moments of tension. The East Los Angeles of the 1950s and early 1960s was a place divided by both geography and opportunity. While some found escape through education or the military, others, like Reynoso, were pulled deeper into the streets. Big Hazard was more than a gang. It was a way of life. Rivalries with other Chicano gangs erupted into violent confrontations, and arrests were almost a rite of passage. For young men like Reynoso, the line between the neighborhood and the prison system blurred quickly. He would soon find himself behind bars, surrounded by men whose influence would shape the next 5 decades of his life. California's prison system was transforming, and so were the men inside it. Out of racial segregation, brutality, and survival emerged new forms of order, criminal organizations built to endure the violence of confinement. One of those organizations was La IM, the Mexican Mafia. When Reynoso first encountered members of the Mexican Mafia, the group was still relatively young. Formed in the late 1950s at Duell Vocational Institution in Tracy, California, La M began as a brotherhood among Mexican-American inmates who sought to unite against rival groups and to control gambling, drug trafficking, and protection rackets inside prison walls. For Reynoso, it offered something familiar yet elevated: the discipline and loyalty of the streets combined with the structure and ambition of an organized syndicate. His transition from Big Hazard soldier to EAM member marked the beginning of his life's defining chapter. The same qualities that earned him respect on the streets, strength, restraint, and an unwavering sense of hierarchy, made him stand out among hardened men who often ruled through chaos. Within La M, Champ became a name synonymous with order. During his early years in the system, Reynoso's demeanor separated him from other inmates. He wasn't known for outbursts or reckless aggression. Instead, He practiced a kind of quiet authority, the kind that commands attention without demanding it. Fellow prisoners noted his strict physical routine. He trained daily, maintaining a fighter's body well into middle age. This discipline became symbolic of his leadership style, measured, steady, and focused on longevity. In a world where most gang leaders rose and fell through impulsive violence, Reynoso built his foundation on patience. The older MA members saw in him a reliability that few possessed. He was not a man easily swayed by emotion, and in an organization defined by betrayal and shifting loyalties, that made him invaluable. As the years passed, Reynoso's reputation grew beyond the cell blocks of California. He became part of what law enforcement would later call the old guard of the Mexican Mafia, a generation of men who defined its identity and set the rules for those who came after. While many of his peers made headlines through sensational acts of violence, Reynoso's influence was quieter, but no less powerful. His early life had prepared him for the long game, for surviving in a system designed to break men. In the unforgiving hierarchy of prison politics, Adolph "Champ" Reynoso stood as proof that control over oneself and others was the ultimate weapon. By the time the 1970s arrived, the boy from East LA had become a name, spoken with respect and caution across multiple state institutions. His transition from gangbanger to organized crime figure was complete. He was no longer simply fighting for neighborhood pride, but for control over entire networks of power and money that extended far beyond the prison walls. Yet even in this rise, Reynoso remained true to the code that had guided him since his youth: discipline above chaos, loyalty above ambition. In a world built on fear and betrayal, Champ Reynoso's calm ruthlessness became his defining signature. His origins, forged in the streets and refined in the cells, had given birth to a leader who would one day help shape the very structure of La Im itself. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Adolph "Champ" Reynoso had become a figure whose name carried weight across California's prison system. While the Mexican Mafia's reputation for savagery was already well known, Reynoso represented something different, a contrast to the impulsive violence that had consumed many of his peers. He was methodical, organized, and above all, disciplined. His quiet strength made him stand out in a brotherhood built on blood oaths and betrayal. As La M.A. spread its influence throughout the state, Reynoso emerged as one of the men capable of keeping that power stable. He belonged to a generation of leaders who understood that brute force could win battles, but order and structure would win wars. Inside the prisons, Reynoso's rise coincided with a transformative period in California's correctional system. Overcrowding, racial violence, and corruption created an environment ripe for control, and the Mexican Mafia seized the opportunity. By uniting Hispanic inmates under one banner, La M.A. consolidated power and began dictating life behind bars: who lived, who died, and who profited. Reynoso became part of this inner circle, helping enforce the rules that would shape the gang's hierarchy. His measured temperament earned him respect from both allies and rivals. He wasn't known for rash decisions or unnecessary bloodshed. When Reynoso acted, it was because the order had to be restored, and he made sure the message was delivered decisively. The 1970s also saw La Im's evolution from a prison clique into a fully structured criminal enterprise. What had begun as a means of survival was now becoming a system of governance within the underworld. Reynoso's influence grew as he helped connect the organization's prison operations with the streets. Through alliances with gangs like Big Hazard, Florencia 13, and other Sureño groups, La M began to extend its reach into neighborhoods across Southern California. These gangs were required to pay taxes from drug sales and other criminal profits, with Reynoso and other senior members ensuring compliance from behind bars. It was an empire run through intimidation, loyalty, and a strict chain of command. Every decision, from who could sell narcotics to how discipline was enforced, could be traced back to men like Champ, whose words carried the weight of law within La Im's shadow government. What made Reynoso particularly effective was his ability to command respect without theatrics. While others sought power through fear or flamboyance, Reynoso ruled through consistency and personal integrity, at least by the standards of prison life. He lived by a code that emphasized honor among brothers, and this adherence to principle made him a stabilizing force. He was known to intervene when petty rivalries threatened to fracture the organization, preferring negotiation and balance over reckless violence. This sense of structure appealed to the older members of La M who remembered its original purpose: to unite, not divide, Mexican-American inmates under one banner. To younger soldiers, he became a living embodiment of the discipline required to survive decades in confinement without losing status or sanity. Law enforcement and prison officials began to take notice of Reynoso's growing influence. Reports described him as one of the most respected elder statesmen of the Mexican Mafia, a man whose calm demeanor masked a strategic mind. Even in a world defined by murder and betrayal, Reynoso maintained an image of professionalism. He was known to keep his living space immaculate, his body fit, and his thoughts sharp. To him, control began with the self. This mindset reflected in how he led others. He valued loyalty, efficiency, and respect over impulsive displays of dominance. Those who served under him often described him as the kind of man you didn't want to disappoint, not out of fear, but because his approval was rare and meaningful. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the Mexican Mafia continued to expand, weaving its influence through state and federal prisons while tightening its grip on the streets. By then, Reynoso was considered part of La M's old guard, the original generation that provided the gang with its foundational code. Younger members came and went, many burned out by drugs, violence, or internal politics. But Reynoso endured. He became a symbol of continuity. The quiet reminder that La M's power didn't just come from brutality. It came from discipline and patience. His ability to adapt to changing times, to balance authority with restraint, made him one of the few long-term survivors in an organization notorious for eating its own. During these decades, Reynoso's relationship with other prominent figures in La M deepened. Men like Joe Pegleg Morgan, the gang's strategist and diplomat, shared a similar outlook: rational control over chaos. While Morgan handled much of the communication between the Mexican Mafia and outside criminal groups, Reynoso's influence remained inside, ensuring that the prison-based leadership remained cohesive and respected. Together with other veterans, he helped steer the organization away from self-destruction and toward a sustainable model of power. To law enforcement, these men represented a terrifying evolution. La M was no longer just a prison gang, it was an institution, and Reynoso was one of its architects. But power always came with a cost. The very structure that Reynoso helped build became the reason for his continued imprisonment and eventual transfer to federal custody. As the government intensified its efforts to dismantle La M, federal indictments and RICO cases began targeting the organization's leadership. Reynoso's name surfaced in investigations throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, cited as one of the gang's key decision-makers. Despite spending much of his adult life behind bars, his reach remained formidable. Authorities knew that a single message from Reynoso could set off a chain of actions across multiple prisons and even on the streets of Los Angeles. He had become the kind of figure law enforcement both feared and respected, a man who embodied the paradox of organized crime, stability born from violence. By the time Reynoso entered the new millennium, his legend within La M was solidified. Younger members referred to him with reverence, often speaking his name as if invoking a ghost of the past, one that still watched over them from the shadows of a cell. His reputation was that of a man who had survived every era of the gang's violent history and who carried its unspoken code in his very presence. He was part of a dying breed, the disciplined originalist who had given La M its spine before corruption and impulsiveness began to erode its values. Inside the prisons, word spread that Champ was still active, still commanding respect, and still loyal to the same principles that had guided him since his Big Hazard days. He was now more than a man. He was a living relic of La Aim's foundation. As the years moved forward, Reynoso's power would eventually find its way into the most secure facility in the United States, where even the most dangerous men were reduced to whispers and coded messages. From the dim corridors of East LA to the stark isolation cells of Florence, Colorado, Champ Reynoso's rise was complete. Yet even as the years took their toll, his will remained unbroken. In the eyes of La M, he had become something rare, a true leader whose strength came not from chaos, but from control. His story, however, was far from over. The next chapter of his life would unfold inside the walls of the nation's most unforgiving prison, where silence became both his weapon and his prison. By the mid-2000s, Adolph "Champ" Reynoso had become one of the oldest active members of the Mexican Mafia, and his presence was both symbolic and strategic. The federal government, recognizing his influence within La M's hierarchy, made the decision to isolate him in the most secure environment possible, the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado, better known as ADX Florence. It was the final stop for America's most dangerous criminals, a place designed to strip men of power, voice, and identity. For Reynoso, however, the move represented something different. It was not an end to his command, but an evolution of it. Even in the confines of a concrete box, Champ continued to exercise influence over a network that extended far beyond the razor wire. ADX Florence was unlike any other prison. Inmates spent 23 hours a day locked in their cells with only an hour of solitary recreation in a caged concrete yard. Human contact was minimal, communication was heavily monitored, and the entire environment was engineered to break the spirit of those inside. But Reynoso was no ordinary inmate. His life had been a long preparation for control under confinement. For decades, he had learned to command silently, to adapt to restriction, and to maintain discipline no matter the circumstances. Where others deteriorated in isolation, Reynoso adapted. His letters, carefully worded and often encoded, became his lifeline to the outside world. Each word was deliberate, every message precise. To his followers, these rare communications carried the weight of doctrine, reinforcing the Mexican Mafia's structure even when its leadership was locked away. Law enforcement agencies worked tirelessly to monitor and intercept these communications, but Reynoso's network was resilient. The Mexican Mafia had evolved into a decentralized system where authority could flow even without direct contact. Messages traveled through lawyers, coded notes, and loyal intermediaries. Reynoso's commands reached prison yards hundreds of miles away, often disguised in casual correspondence or legal paperwork. Federal investigators would later describe his ability to maintain order as remarkably disciplined, noting that his name surfaced repeatedly in intercepted messages about taxation, discipline, and peace agreements between rival gangs. From the confines of ADX Florence, Reynoso demonstrated that leadership was not about presence. It was about perception. His silence carried more authority than another man's threats. Inside the walls of Florence, Reynoso lived a life of strict routine. Each day followed a schedule that reflected the same self-control that had earned him his nickname decades earlier. He exercised daily in the small space between his bed and the concrete wall, kept his area immaculate, and maintained a sharp mind through reading and reflection. Prison staff noted that he rarely spoke, even to guards. He remained polite but distant, a man at peace with the isolation that had driven others to madness. To younger IME members who heard stories about him, he became almost mythical, an image of endurance and unshakable authority. In the culture of La IME, survival was the truest form of victory, and Reynoso had mastered it. But despite his calm, Reynoso's placement in ADX was part of a broader federal strategy to sever the Mexican Mafia's communication lines. The government had learned from past mistakes, cutting off leaders like Joe Pegleg Morgan and Rodolfo Cheyenne. Cadena had never completely dismantled the organization. Now they were trying to silence men like Reynoso, whose quiet influence posed a more subtle threat. Yet the irony was that isolation only deepened his legend. To many within the prison system, Champ represented the unbreakable spirit of La M, the idea that even total confinement could not destroy the organization's foundation. He became a symbol of continuity, a reminder that the gang's oldest principles, discipline, unity, and silence, were still alive, even in the age of surveillance and supermax prisons. In his later years, Reynoso's body began to fail, but his mind remained sharp. Cancer, the one enemy he couldn't outthink or outlast, began to take hold. Despite his declining health, those who interacted with him described a man who never complained, who faced his illness with the same stoicism that had defined his life. The solitude of Florence became a kind of monastery, a place where Reynoso reflected on a lifetime of choices that had brought him both respect and confinement. He had outlived most of his peers, survived countless internal purges, and remained loyal to the same organization he had joined as a young man decades earlier. To the end, he was a man defined by consistency, never renouncing his affiliation, never betraying his code. The younger generation of Mexican Mafia members continued to revere him. In a world where leadership often burned out in violence or greed, Reynoso was seen as one of the last true generals of La M, men who valued discipline over indulgence. His advice, even secondhand, was treated as gospel. Some members reportedly kept his words written down, a kind of scripture within a culture built on survival and loyalty. To them, Champ wasn't just a relic. He was a living connection to the origins of the organization, a figure who had witnessed its transformation from a handful of rebellious inmates to a nationwide criminal syndicate. He embodied the paradox of the Mexican Mafia itself, ruthless yet restrained, violent yet bound by rules, invisible yet omnipresent. As Reynoso's health worsened, the federal system made limited accommodations for his medical needs, eventually transferring him under guard to a hospital in Colorado. Even then, the image of control never left him. Guards who escorted him described an old man who moved slowly but carried himself with dignity. There was no panic, no visible fear, only a quiet acceptance. After decades of confinement, Reynoso understood that power was fleeting, but reputation was eternal. In the corridors of ADX Florence and beyond, his name continued to circulate as a figure of respect, a reminder of what it meant to lead without noise. His years in isolation had turned him into something rare in the world of organized crime, a symbol of discipline that time itself could not erase. By the time he reached his mid-70s, Reynoso was one of the few remaining bridges to La M's foundational generation. The men who had once built an empire behind bars were now mostly dead or forgotten, but Champ endured, silently watching as new leaders rose and fell, as younger members fought over a legacy they barely understood. He had seen the Mexican Mafia's rise from its infancy to its global infamy. He had witnessed its structure evolve, its alliances form and collapse, and its name become both feared and mythologized. And through it all, he had remained constant, an embodiment of the old code in a new age of chaos. In the sterile, isolated world of Florence ADX, Adolph Champ Reynoso had found a strange kind of peace, the peace of a man who had already conquered everything that could be taken from him. By 2018, Adolph Champ Reynoso's life had entered its quiet final chapter. The decades of confinement, the weight of age, and the creeping advance of cancer had finally taken their toll on a man who had once seemed indestructible. After years of isolation in the Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado, Reynoso's health declined rapidly, forcing the Bureau of Prisons to transfer him to a nearby medical center under tight security. Federal guards stood watch outside his hospital room, but there was little left to guard. The man who had commanded soldiers, issued orders, and shaped the course of the Mexican Mafia's history now faced an enemy he could neither command nor outlast. On November 21st, 2018, Adolph Champ Reynoso died quietly in a Colorado hospital at the age of 75. There was no violence, no last act of defiance, just silence, fitting for a man who had ruled through it his entire life. For many within La M, his death marked the end of an era. Reynoso belonged to a generation of men who had lived by a strict code, a code forged in the early days of the California prison system when loyalty, discipline, and silence were the pillars of survival. The Mexican Mafia had changed since those days. Younger members were more reckless, drawn to the chaos of drugs and money rather than the order their predecessors had maintained. Reynoso's passing was more than the death of an individual. It symbolized the fading of a philosophy that had once defined the gang. Those who knew him understood that he represented a kind of leadership rarely seen anymore, calm, composed, and built on control rather than fear. To them, Champ was not just another shot caller. He was a man who carried La M's history in his very presence. Within the prison system, news of Reynoso's death spread quickly and quietly. Older inmates, many of whom had served time with him decades earlier, reflected on his legacy. Even rival gang members, long accustomed to viewing La M with hostility, acknowledged the respect he commanded. He had been part of a unique generation of prison leaders, men who were not merely criminals but strategists, who turned chaos into structure and violence into policy. To guards, investigators, and federal agents, Reynoso was the embodiment of the Mexican Mafia's evolution from a prison-born survival pact into a sophisticated network of organized crime. He had been there when it began and had lived long enough to see it become something almost unrecognizable. Yet even as the organization expanded and modernized, its core ideals, the very ones Reynoso had upheld, remained intact: respect, loyalty, silence. Reynoso's body was cremated quietly, his remains claimed by no family members known to the public. There was no grand funeral, no tribute in the streets of East Los Angeles. His passing, like much of his life, was handled with discretion. But in the coded conversations of La M's imprisoned hierarchy, his name was spoken with reverence. For the men still active in the organization, Reynoso's memory was a reminder of what it meant to be truly committed. He had never cooperated with law enforcement, never betrayed his oath, and never allowed the erosion of discipline that consumed so many around him. In the unforgiving world of organized crime, that kind of consistency was rare. His death, while inevitable, carried symbolic weight. It was the closing of a chapter in La M's long and violent history. Even among federal officials who had spent their careers tracking the Mexican Mafia, there was a certain grudging respect for Reynoso. He was, by all accounts, an intelligent and pragmatic leader. Unlike others who sought fame or notoriety, he operated in the shadows, preferring anonymity over spectacle. Agents described him as one of the last professionals of the old émé, a man who understood power as something to be managed, not flaunted. His longevity was no accident. It was the result of discipline, restraint, and a deep understanding of human nature. For nearly 60 years, Reynoso had navigated one of the most dangerous criminal environments in America without ever losing his standing. Few men could claim the same. His life was a paradox, the story of a man who found structure in confinement, purpose in silence, and identity within an organization built on secrecy and blood. As time passed, Reynoso's name began to take on a legendary quality among younger inmates who had never met him. In a generation where chaos often replaced strategy, Champ became a myth, an example of the old way. They heard stories of his precision, his calm demeanor, his unshakable command, even in isolation. To many, he represented the unattainable standard, a leader who ruled through respect rather than fear, who never wavered from the code even as the world around him changed. For historians and criminologists studying the evolution of the Mexican Mafia, Reynoso's legacy became a critical link between the organization's origins and its modern form. He was one of the few who had witnessed its entire arc, from its inception in the California prison system of the 1950s to its transformation into a nationwide criminal syndicate. In the end, the man called Champ lived and died by the same principles that defined the gang he helped build. He believed in loyalty, in order, and in the belief that silence was power. He had no illusions about what he was or the choices he made, yet he remained steadfast in his identity until his final breath. There were no confessions, no apologies, and no attempts at redemption. To Reynoso, his life's path had been chosen long ago, and he walked it without regret. In death, as in life, he remained the embodiment of the Mexican Mafia's code, unyielding, silent, and enduring. As the world around La M continued to change, his memory lingered like a shadow over its future, a reminder of the era when men like Adolph Champ Reynoso ruled not through noise or notoriety, but through discipline, control, and the quiet command of respect.